Good evening and welcome to our final session for our Advent series this year. It's great to have you with us again, and it's a blessing for us, and we hope it's been a blessing for you. As always, we'll come by beginning our night acknowledging country. I'm coming to you tonight from the lands of the Warra people, and we begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which we gather today. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Just hand over to Mary Collar, who will read our Advent prayer. Thanks, Mary.
The Advent story of hope and mystery, anticipation, preparation, a kingdom of this world and the next, and a king appearing when we least expect. Heaven touching earth, the footsteps of the divine walking dusty roads as once they did in Eden, and a people searching for a saviour and walking past the stable, open eyes and hearts that this might be an advent of hope to the world.
Amen to that. Thank you. David, would you like to give us some introductory remarks from Garratt's point of view?
Well, welcome everybody, and so delighted to have you join us again. Can you believe it? It's week 4. It feels like we've just started our journey, but in a week's time, it is the day of days, so to speak. So welcome everybody. Now, as usual, people have already started to do it. I think over the years we've trained people so well, but if you are seeking accreditation, we would ask that you would put your name, your email, preferably the email that you use to register for these sessions. If you're in Victoria, please put your VIT numbers in and we'll record your professional development hours. If you're not seeking accreditation, disregard this message completely. You don't need to do anything. You can sit back with a cuppa or a glass of wine and enjoy this evening, and I hope you do. Now, just on the registrations, we close for our Christmas break on Friday. But when the team come back in mid to late January, we'll start doing all of the work that we need to do to record your hours and get your certificates across to you as quickly as possible. If you in fact need them ASAP, please just email us and let us know that you need them ASAP. Otherwise, you can expect them in February or thereabouts. That's it from me until the very end, I suspect. Chris and Mary. And Mary, thank you again so much for joining us tonight. And we're very much looking forward to what you have to say.
Thanks, David. So I hand it over to Mary Rayburn, who's going to take us through the first reading for next Sunday. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, David. Thank you, Mary. Yes, we are at the 4th Sunday of Advent, and it is a little bewildering at this time, I think, to know that we're at that point where Christmas is almost upon us. And yet these sessions are a time, an opportunity to really think about something of the meaning of Christmas and the meaning of Advent more particularly. We have yet again a text from the prophetic tradition from Micah, chapter 5. In the first week, we had a reading from Jeremiah. In week 2, we had a reading from Baruch, and some regard Baruch as a prophet and some don't, so a little bit of uncertainty there. Week 3, we had Zephaniah as the first reading and a text from Isaiah as the responsorial psalm. So we've had a lot of prophetic texts, and I think it's important that we really remember what prophecy is, and it's not so much the foretelling, or certainly not foretelling a future a long way off. It's more forthtelling God's view of life, almost in the present. So Micah is one of the 8th century prophets. He was active in the southern kingdom in Judah at the time when there were two kingdoms. So that's really important historical information for us to remember. His contemporaries were Amos, who is from Judah but active in the northern kingdom in Israel, Hosea, who is from the northern kingdom and active there, and Isaiah, the 8th century prophet Isaiah, who was active in Judah. So he has some contemporaries. There are prophetic figures earlier in the historical books, but these are the earliest ones after whom a book is named. Many also put Jonah in this, and the story of Jonah is set in a similar context, but the book of Jonah is written much, much later, and we need to keep remembering that the time difference between when a story is situated and when it's written. So the prophetic message was addressed to an immediate situation or to the consequences of the present for the future, for a more immediate future. And the prophet spoke his or her message, and there were women prophets. My favourite one is Huldah, but there were women also who had this role, not women who have a book named after them. So, as I said, the prophetic message was spoken and only later written down, and then there is evidence of a lot of editorial work, a lot of redactional work in the prophetic books. So the later writers start to reflect upon what they're hearing from the prophets, and they start to see patterns, a pattern. And if I can put the pattern very simplistically, it's the people sin or people turn away from God, and then they turn again to God, and God responds with hesed, with that Hebrew word that means covenantal love, loyal love, fidelity. It's part of the covenantal relationship. So when we come to the book of Micah, and our text tonight is addressed really to the city of Bethlehem. It begins, the Lord says, but you, Ephratah, Bethlehem, the least of the clans of Judah. So that's how the text, the reading begins. So it's addressed to the town. Just like we've seen Zion personified, here we have Bethlehem personified, if you like. And Bethlehem is told that it's the least of the cities of Judah. It's not an important place. It's like the speaker is saying, you're a nobody. And yet you will be the birthplace of my chosen one. Or the text actually says, the one who will rule over Israel. So I thought it was a chance to reflect a little bit on Bethlehem. And as we do, you might keep Bethlehem in your prayers, Bethlehem of the present day in your prayers very much, as they're suffering a lot too. But going back to biblical times, Ruth goes with Naomi. Ruth is a Moabitess, a foreigner, but she returns. When Naomi returns, Ruth goes with her mother-in-law to Bethlehem. And Ruth is, in fact, the great-grandmother of King David. And then David, a few generations later, is born in Bethlehem. And David is a shepherd. And still today you can see sheep and shepherds out with them in that area. And so it's almost as, because David then becomes the foundation of the concept of Messiah, Jesus is born also in Bethlehem. That's what the Matthew and Luke's gospel tell us. So it's a theological reality. It's not. We don't have a birth certificate. We don't know where Jesus was born, but it's theologically really important that Jesus is born there. And the text goes on, you, Bethlehem, the least of the clans of Judah, out of you will be born for me one who is to rule over Israel. His origin goes back to the distant past, to days of old. The Lord is therefore going to abandon them. So a sense that the people will be abandoned until when? Until she who is to give birth gives birth. It's a beautiful image, but it's not clear. Many will suggest, as the text of Isaiah does a little more, that it's a son of the Davidic king. But the text doesn't tell us. She who is to give birth gives birth. And then it goes on to say, he, the one who is born, will feed his flock. And so we have this beginning of that association of the idea of shepherd with the king, because God was the shepherd par excellence. The king was to be a mirror image of God, especially in the way he ruled. Wasn't always the case, but that was the theology. So this new king is to be a shepherd who will take care of the flock. And this reminds us that all that imagery contributes to the idea of a Messiah, which means literally an anointed one. But the concept grew and grew and grew. But it's founded in the beginnings with the idea of the Davidic king, and then Jesus in that line, in the line of David. So I think for us, Christmas is a real act of faith. And the question is, do we allow Jesus to be the Messiah in our life? Do we allow Jesus to introduce that new age, that new period of life, that flourishing of life in our lives? So thank you, Mika, for the questions, for the background.
Thank you, Mary. That's a really great start for us tonight. And I liked you talking about how patterns emerge in Israel's story. I think that's really important because there's a lovely saying that says hindsight is 20/20 vision. And of course, everything is clear in hindsight, but that's what happens, isn't it? That Israel, they see patterns emerging in their own story, not only their patterns of acting, but also God's pattern of acting,
Yes.
as you said, with chesed, with that loving kindness that always comes back and finds a new way, God riding straight with crooked lines. And in this case, it's with Bethlehem, this city which is not so important. And yet in God's story, it becomes something really special. Yeah, very much. Lovely.
Mary, while you're talking about Bethlehem, I thought people might like to see shepherds in a field in Bethlehem.
In Bethlehem,
In
yes.
Bethlehem. And then,
Yes.
of course, the other side of Bethlehem is it's in the Palestinian territory. There's a great wall between the Palestinian and the Israeli territory, and the sadness that's with it. So I just thought that might help.
Thanks, Mary. All right, so we've got a really good start in terms of our first reading from Mika, and now over to our responsorial psalm. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, everyone. Okay, so you can see from the heading there just how cut up the psalm is, and yet it holds together. It holds well enough, and it's a response to our first reading. And the theme of shepherd is very strong in this psalm, but it's not the only metaphor that's there. And I think in this context, it does serve a liturgical task, even in its slightly cut up form. In fact, the whole psalm is a beautifully haunting community lament. And we glimpse something of this even in the abbreviated form. But the the communal lament is ultimately a lament about the loss of the Davidic kingship. And so we saw in Micah how important the Davidic kingship was, and yet here the people are lamenting that loss. So the people are recognizing that they have turned away from God and are suffering the consequences of this turning. And I think it offers us something to reflect on today. Lots of events in our world seem to be a turning away from God. And in this season of Advent, God is calling us as a community as well as individuals to turn again towards God. So the two right. I'm having the same problem again. The two beautiful metaphors that we come across in this psalm are shepherd and vine. And God is portrayed really as the shepherd and as the vine dresser. He's not so much the vine, the people are the vine, and God is portrayed as the vine dresser. So these two beautiful metaphors that dominate this whole psalm. Our response to this psalm is, Lord, make us turn to you. Let us see your face and we shall be saved. And the verb to turn is shuv. It has the very ordinary meaning in Hebrew of turning around, but in other forms, it has a theological meaning to repent, if you like, similar to the Greek metanoia, to turn towards rather than away from. And even the image there of two people, back to back, clearly not in communication, communicating their displeasure. They're turning away from each other. So in this response, we say, Lord, make us turn to you. And yet, in other biblical traditions, we know and we see that to see God's face was to die. So when we're saying turn to you, it is metaphorical, but it's also saying, let us turn towards your ways, towards your presence, not necessarily to see your face. So the responsorial psalm begins, O shepherd of Israel. And we've already heard tonight that whole image of shepherd. First here, it's addressed to God. So God is the shepherd par excellence. The Davidic king was to be a mirror of that. Not always the case, but that was the idea, the understanding, the theological understanding. And then, Lord, rouse up your might. O Lord, come to our help. In this, God is called on to help the people, really as a warrior fighting for them, and as a shepherd who will guard his sheep. Fight for us as you did in earlier times. And so the people are remembering. And then the second section of the responsorial psalm, God of hosts, turn again, we implore, look down from heaven and see, visit this vine and protect it, the vine your right hand has planted. So the people feel here that God has turned away from them. And that's a heartache. And we've all probably felt this. We felt the absence of God. I'm not saying God does turn away from us, but I'm saying that it can feel that God has turned away from us. And so we know a vine, the image of a vine here, visit this vine and protect it, the vine that your right hand has planted. God is the one who has planted this vine. And the people are imploring God to visit them again. And then finally, the third section that we have in the responsorial psalm, may your hand be on the one you have chosen, the one you have given your strength. and we shall never forsake you again. Give us life that we may call upon your name. And what really struck me tonight was, we shall never forsake you again. And that's part of the pattern in the life of Israel. They forsook God, and then they called out to God, and then God took them back out of Chesed. And we know that pattern in our lives. God can become, even if we don't give up on God, God can become taken for granted in our lives. So this plea, we shall never forsake you again. Give us life that we may call on your name. And in a way, they're saying, give us a chosen leader, a Davidic king. And in our liturgical context here in Advent, we think of Jesus, of the line of David. So in Advent, I suggest that we're called to turn towards God. In Advent, we welcome God into our lives yet again, because we too turn away. God as shepherd, God as gardener or vine dresser. We welcome not so much the baby Jesus as the incarnation, the feast. I like to think of Christmas as the feast of the incarnation, where God's desire to be with us, to be enfleshed with us, to incarnate with us. It's a reminder, really, that God was present with his people Israel, and is present with his people Israel, even when they did not respond. And God is present with us as Christians in the person of Jesus, even when we don't respond. The psalm reminds us to turn towards God, and this is the power that allows us to turn towards God, because God's desire is to be with us. And, just the power of God, and yet God's desire is to be with us. So in these four texts, I like the idea of turning to be there quite clearly. In Micah, it's to return to God. In the Psalm, it's turn towards God. In the letter to the Hebrews, it echoes the "Here I am," the Hineni, which is often a response by a prophet to their call. Here I am. I'm willing to turn towards you, God. And then in Luke, Mary and Elizabeth turn towards each other in their unexpected pregnancies, and in that they turn towards God. So let's hope that this last week, as we prepare for the feast of Christmas, for the feast of the Incarnation, that we too will turn towards God. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. That's really, I think, very powerful invitation to us to take up that offer. You're just saying about give us life, and it's very much there. And also thinking about David as in the king, and then of course leading into our next reading, the idea of Melchizedek, who was both a priest and king as well, and the idea of the body, or that'll come up in Hebrews in another way as well. So that's good. There was a question there, David. Do you want to just share with us what question? Yep.
Mary. I can read it.
Yeah, thanks, Mary.
I've got it.
Okay, so it's to you, Mary. Do you think this psalm juxtaposes Lent's prayer of turn away from sin and be faithful to the gospel, which is how we started Lent? Or do you think about it?
Yes, I'll think about it. Maybe I'll respond at the end.
Okay.
Okay. Well, but it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because you say one is turning away and the other one is turning towards.
Towards.
So two moments to see how that might go. All right. So let's move along to our reading from Hebrews then. So the first thing I put down what might be what you were thinking if you'd actually read through the reading for next Sunday from Hebrews 10:5 to 10. What's this reading got to do with Advent? Because it's a very un-Advent kind of reading, picking up one of the images from the Psalms and talking about Jesus as high priest. But I think that that Mary has just given us a bit of an indication as to how that can work, because it's that idea of Jesus giving of himself. So I think that will be a little bit of a key as we go through the reading itself. One of the things about the letter to the Hebrews is that it's answering questions that were there for Jewish Christians. For after the death of Jesus and after the destruction of or maybe even before the destruction of the temple, were the temple rituals important and necessary after the death of Jesus? How were Jewish Christians going to deal with all the worship that went on in the temple? If you remember, if you go through the beginning of Acts of the Apostles, the Gospel of Luke ends with the disciples in the temple precincts praying, and it begins with the disciples in the temple. So what was going to be the status of its rituals and its sacrifices? So this was a burning question for the letter to the Hebrews. So in sense, working out, is it going to be a story of continuity or a question of closure? So we'll just look at what the text says. It's interesting there. So the first part is Jesus' words. This is what Christ said on coming into the world. And of course, this sounds like an adult. You can't expect the baby Jesus to be saying this. It's a theological interpretation. You wanted no sacrifice or oblation, prepared a body for me. You took no pleasure in holocausts or sacrifices for sin. Then I said, just as I was commanded in the scroll of the book, God, here I am. I'm coming to obey your will. Now, Mary, you'll know as someone who studies the Psalms, that the New Testament translation is different to what you've got in the Hebrew, because in the Hebrew it's talking about almost like opening an ear, but now once it came into Greek, it's changed to body. But I think that's probably part of the link for us when we're thinking about Jesus' incarnation, becoming one like us. So when coming into the world, here I am, I'm coming to obey your will. So it's giving us a theological key to understand Jesus' purpose in becoming one like us. Here I am, I'm coming to obey your will. So that deep sense of listening that we're all called to, invited to in this time of Advent, of course, all the year as well. So the first part of our reading is talking about Jesus' word. The second part is really the explanation that the letter to the Hebrew gives us. So when you've got like the teacher, really, isn't it? Notice that he says first, you did not want what the law lays down as the things to be offered. That is, the sacrifices, the oblations, the holocausts, and the sacrifices for sin. And you took no pleasure in them. And then he says, here I am. I'm coming to obey your will. He's abolishing the first sort to replace it with the second. And this will was for us to be made holy by the offering of his body, made once and for all by Jesus Christ. So there's certainly an element of discontinuity in the letter to the Hebrews. In other words, what went on in the sacrifices in the temple has now been superseded by the one and all sacrifice, once and for all, by Jesus. But I suspect it's because also that the letter to the Hebrews is written after the temple has been destroyed. So that changes the perspective, of course, isn't it? Hindsight's 20/20 vision, and probably they can say this with a lot more clarity after the destruction of the temple than before. So that's the reading for next Sunday there. So just a little bit about sacrifices in Israel. So sacrifices came in very, very different forms. You had communion sacrifices where elements would be shared. You had burnt offerings where everything, like a Holocaust, everything given to God. You had sin offerings that were made. So all part of the worship of the temple. So what these sacrifices were doing was asking for God's care, or celebrating God's help, healing the wounds of sin, and strengthening the community's relationship with God and with each other. So one of the things that we need to realize in the ancient world, when you were offering a sacrifice, you were trying to somehow or other bring about God's goodwill towards you. But when we look at the letters of Paul, and it's really important to understand this, for Paul, God does for us what we cannot do for ourselves. God is the one offering. Jesus offers himself. So it turns the sacrificial system upon its head, because it's us not healing the relationship, it's God healing, God taking the initiative. So the Psalms and prophets, in a way this wasn't new, in the Psalms and prophets often pointed out the ineffectiveness of just going through the ritual. Unless the heart is involved, it was deemed to be useless and an insult to God. So from Jeremiah, lovely example. Of what use to me is frankincense that comes from Sheba, or sweet cane from a distant land? Your burnt offerings are not acceptable, nor are your sacrifices pleasing to me. And I'm sure Queenslanders would listen to this text from Jeremiah with all their sugarcane fields, feeling about it a little bit different to those of us down in the south. But Psalm 51, we know it very well. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. So God is looking to the heart, and I suppose that's part of the turning that Mary, you were talking about from the Psalm and Micah as well. So for the letter to the Hebrews, Jesus replaces the Jewish sacrificial system. It starts here in his incarnation. He offers his own body and self. His sacrifice is once and for all. So for the letter to the Hebrews, there's no further need for the sacrificial system. And as God's Son, Jesus is the eternal and compassionate high priest, the one we long for and the one who goes before us. So the letter to the Hebrews celebrates Jesus' gift of himself as the ultimate sacrifice. So Jesus is not the unwitting victim of human violence and opposition. As Paul would say in Galatians 2:20, this Jesus who loved me and gave himself for me. This is what he has come to do among us to do. Here I am, I come to do your will. And so Hebrews stresses this happens from the very beginning of Jesus' life on coming into the world. So what's all this got to do with us this Advent? To what extent then are we really giving of ourselves? Here am I come to do your will. Because these are challenging words. Are we prepared to listen to the will and needs of God and others this Advent? As this picture of God here, am I living fully alive or just going through the motions? And here's a little cartoon I thought that might be helpful for you. In football teams, they often ask in code, are you a pig or a chicken? So this is the context for it. So you've got the chicken and the pig. Hey, pig, we should open a restaurant. Oh, I'm not sure. What would we call it? Ham and eggs? And the pig says, no, thanks. I'd be committed and you'd only be involved. You know, it's like the hen is giving the eggs, but for the pig, it's a life commitment, isn't it? So it's just for us to think about, to what degree are we going through the motions? Are we going to be like the chicken and give where it's easy, or are we going to give of ourselves? So that's a challenge for Advent. But the encouragement is, of course, that Jesus walks with us until we walk with him. Here I am, I come to do your will. So over to you, Mary.
Chapter 1. And finally, Christmas is about a birth. And so far, all we've heard about is Jesus and John. But finally, we meet the mothers. Right? We meet Mary, we meet Elizabeth in the Gospel for this Sunday. So I've called this reflection Women of Faith. So it begins, and I've added verse 36 and verse 56 because I think they're important for understanding this passage. And now your relative Elizabeth in her old age has also conceived a son, and this is the 6th month for her who was said to be barren. And the Sunday's reading starts, in those days Mary set out and went with haste to a Judean town in the hill country, where she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leapt in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit, and exclaimed with a loud cry, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why has this happened to me, that the mother of my Lord comes to me? For as soon as I heard the sound of your greeting, the child in my womb leapt for joy. And blessed is she who believed that there would be fulfillment of what was spoken to her by the Lord." And then I've added, Mary remained with her about 3 months and went home. So the reading is the great coming together of the mothers of John and Jesus, 2 pregnant women greeting one another, the 2 critical people in this story. And as any parent would know, pregnancy is a time of longing, of hoping, a time of joy, and yes, also a time of anxiety. And so the pregnancy of Mary and Elizabeth provide a great symbol of the meaning of Advent, as we too wait with longing, with hope, with joy, and yes, some anxiety. And it's in this meeting that Elizabeth feels for the first time the stirring of her child. This is the time when she feels and knows that what Zechariah had conveyed is true. Up until now, she's just had to take his word, at least what he wrote. And now Elizabeth is filled with her own sense of delight, and with the power of the Holy Spirit, she gives praise for the child in Mary's womb. And with prophetic insight, she perceives the greatness of Mary's child, the mother of my Lord. But while recognizing the blessedness of Mary's child, Elizabeth also calls Mary blessed for her faith. In fact, Elizabeth says she's blessed because of her faith more than her maternity. Mary believes. And this is her greatness and her importance in the Christian tradition. She's a woman of faith and a mother. Now, part of the symbolism, I think, that lies behind Luke's story of the visitation is the Ark of the Covenant. Luke says Mary remained with Elizabeth for about 3 months. And that's the time the Ark of the Covenant rested outside Jerusalem in the Judean hills. Now, the Ark of the Covenant was just a box carried by the people of Israel when they left Mount Sinai. God was not inside the box, but the Ark symbolized God's presence with them. And they even carried the Ark into their battles. God is present with them. That caused problems because in one of the battles with the Philistines, the Ark was captured. You might remember the Philistines. Goliath was a Philistine and then David beat him. Well, when the Ark went into the temple of the Philistines, it did not cause blessings. In fact, it caused problems. So it wasn't long before the Philistines asked Israel to come and get the Ark. And so the Ark was carried on a cart, and that's what you see on this slide. A cart pulled by oxen all the way back to Jerusalem. But it didn't go into the city. And we'll see that on the next slide. Instead, it stayed for 3 months in the hill country of Judea. That image there you see is from the synagogue in Capernaum. So Mark probably very familiar with that symbol of the Ark of the Covenant. So there it is on its journey into the hill country just outside Jerusalem as Mary travelled into the hill country. Now here's David. David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. I've highlighted the ark remained 3 months. And Luke says Mary remained 3 months and then returned to her own home. So this is behind one of the titles Mary is given, Ark of the Covenant. And this is an image of Mary standing above the Ark of the Covenant, and you've got the cherubim wings there. And this statue is at a place just outside Jerusalem that is identified as the place where the ark rested when David was afraid to take it into Jerusalem, a place called Abu Ghosh. And we read in the book of Exodus and Numbers that when the ark was complete, the glory cloud of the Lord, the Shekinah, the presence of God, covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Hear that symbolism in the story of a young girl and the Spirit overshadowing her. And in her pregnancy, she too is filled with the presence of God. We call Mary the God-bearer, the Theotokos. The visitation prefigures one of Luke's themes, the theme that God is visiting the people. That's the joyful message of Luke's Gospel, God's merciful visitation of the people. So Zechariah, when he gets his voice back, sings, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel. God has visited God's people and redeemed them." And then through the Gospel, that's exactly what Jesus does. He visits people in their homes. So he goes to the home of Peter, where his mother-in-law is ill. He goes to the home, visits the home of Simon the Pharisee and Zacchaeus. And Jesus also invites people into his home to be at his table. Even before the Gospel begins, in these early chapters, we're getting a glimpse of what his ministry to be. God is coming to God's people. God is visiting God's people. And that visitation is given flesh in this visitation of a young woman to Elizabeth. When I was thinking about the Gospel, sometimes I think, poor Mary. I think we do her a great disservice. We make statues, we put her on pedestals. In our art and in our hymns, she's often presented as rather meek and a bit insipid. When I think of Mary, she must have been a strong woman, a woman of great courage to take the risks she did. And so I want to share with you tonight a song that I think better expresses Mary's role in our lives.
2, 3, 4. Come, Teach me to believe in the darkness, woman of faith. Teach me how to see the way to go, woman who walks. Teach me how to love in the pain, woman of God. Knowing His love always remains ever the same, and may His will be done, woman of God. Come, show me how to pray, just as He did, woman who knows. Show me how to lay my life for them, woman who loves. May I not be scared of the cross, woman of pain. Knowing His love always remains ever the same, and may His will be done, woman of God. Do whatever He did, live as He lived, love each other as He loved, onto a cross until the end. No, there's nothing that can keep you from His love. Do whatever He did, live as He lived, love each other as He loved, onto a cross until the end. No, there's nothing that can keep you from His love, woman of God. Come, teach us to believe in the darkness, woman of faith. Teach us how to see the way to go, woman who walks. Teach us how to love in the pain, woman of God. Knowing His love always remains ever the same, and may His will be done, woman of God. Do whatever He did, live as He lived, love each other as He loved, onto a cross until the end. No, there's nothing that can keep you from His love. Do whatever He did, live as He lived, love each other as He loved, onto a cross until the end. No, there's nothing that can keep you from His love, woman of God. Woman of God. Woman of God.
That didn't quite come through as well as I hoped. But if you go online, you can always hear Maeve online. It's a beautiful song, and it certainly captures something of Mary as a woman of faith, a woman of strong faith. And some of the themes Mary spoke about and Chris spoke about came together there. That beautiful image of the two women turning with their faces to each other in their pregnancy. I thought that was lovely, and it certainly picked up what you were saying, Mary Rayburn. And celebrating that Christmas isn't about a baby. It's about God, a God who comes to us, who becomes one of us, not just becomes like us, but actually becomes one of us, becomes human. That's what incarnate means. God becomes one of us. And that's what we celebrate, that there's nothing outside our experience that God can't be part of. And that's what I will be celebrating, end of next week. Thanks, David.
Right. There was a question from Mary Rayburn, in the psalm about a contrite spirit or broken so the contrite part we understand, but in the psalm when it talks about a broken spirit, do you want to say anything about that in terms of what the Hebrew would be trying to lead us to?
I don't have a Hebrew Bible here with me at this moment, but it's poetry, and poetry always works in exaggeration in a way to make the point, and so it's in parallel with a contrite spirit, and that's it's not that we have to be broken down as human beings, but it is our contrite spirit that becomes our means almost of turning towards God. And I just wanted to comment on the other question was there about turning away from sin and being faithful to the gospel. And I think it implies that, but it's more, the emphasis more is on turning towards God. The emphasis is not on the sin is so much, although that's part of it, and that's part of our reality. I don't always use the word sin because in one way, sin is quite a deliberate choice, whereas often we just stray away from God or God's ways. It's not, there's nothing deliberate in it. So turning away is one side of it, but turning towards is for me a much more positive and engaging thing. And I think our broken, sometimes it is when we are a broken spirit that we know our need of God, and therefore we turn towards God somewhat differently. But I don't think the psalm is in any way trying to promote brokenness, but it knows brokenness, and in that moment, in that experience, turns towards God.
And I think also that you've got the element of, which is very deep within the scriptures, of not building yourself up beyond, like you start with the Tower of Babel, if you like, trying to build yourself up to be God. And so many times the text will be inviting us back to know who God is, know who you are. And that's, I think, part of what the psalm is saying, isn't it? That you're realizing you're not putting yourself first, you're not putting yourself above God. There was a question from Jonathan. He was asking about that whole question of seeing God face to face, and Paul reflects on that text when he's later on in 2 Corinthians. Actually, he'll talk about the glory of God in the face of Jesus, which is in 2 Corinthians 4:6. So not a glory that burns, but a glory that heals, a glory that holds us. And so that's the thing, that the invitation, I think, that we've been receiving in this time. So that's all to the good. David, do you have? Sorry, Mary, go for it.
I just want to talk about that. I think there's another insight into seeing God face to face. I think the experience is so overwhelming. To really encounter God, even in life, is an overwhelming experience, and yet to actually see God face to face, to come into that intensity, in a way we die, not necessarily physically, but we die in that sense of humility that you're talking about, Chris, in sense of knowing ourselves as puny in relationship to God.
Yeah, I think so. David, have you got any thoughts?
Well, I just
Hand
got
over to
one.
you because I'm aware of the fact we've got 4 minutes to go.
Yeah. Just very quickly, Bernard has said, the older I get, maybe the better word is mature, but the older I get, I'm more thinking our Catholic liturgy is overwhelmed by the theology of sin.
Yeah.
You got any comments there? Any? There's nodding, Bernard. So your wisdom is coming through in your years, clearly.
Yeah, yeah. Certainly, we're often focusing only on one part of the equation, which is a pity. Definitely, and just I might just share a little quote here because Mary was just talking about seeing God face to face, and there's a lovely little quote from the Proslogion of Saint Anselm, which I'll just if I can bring that up, might just be helpful there. Be in mind to look upon your light, even from afar, even from the depths. Teach me to seek you and reveal yourself to me. When I seek you, for I cannot seek you except you teach me, nor find you except you reveal yourself. Let me see you in longing, let me long for you in seeking, let me find you in love, and love you in finding. It's just one of the beautiful texts, I think, from Anselm there. And when that's what we want, isn't it? It's not that fear of being burnt away, but that light that leads us home. That's what we celebrate.
And see, as a Johannite person, in John, sin hardly rates a mention. The cross is not about atonement or forgiveness. It's about being born again.
Yeah.
The image of the flow of blood and water is birthing imagery.
Yeah.
So, and in the early church, there were so many words to try and describe what Jesus was doing. It wasn't really till a bit later that one image settled and made sense to people at that time. And that was a sense of sin being so horrible that God had to send his son to make reparation. Now, crazy as it sounds, that seemed to make sense at that time. And that's the one that stuck. And, I think we need to be looking at more ways. Paul has many more terms for talking about what Jesus was doing. So does John. There's a question in here about the ark. Was the ark in Greek? Is the ark the same word as manger? I've just had a quick look. No, it's not. The ark was simply a box. At Mount Sinai, a wooden box. The manger was a feeding trough. No, so no, they're not related. One held the glory of God, the ark, and the manger was just something animals fed out of. So it's almost a contrast, God becoming one of us in a manger, not in an ark.
And that's why we speak of Mary as the ark. Because in our Christian tradition, we believe that she held the presence of God, just as the ark of the covenant did. It didn't limit the presence of God. It was a representation, a symbol in the full sense of symbol.
Thank you.
Just while Mary's looking for questions, if I might take the liberty, I would just like to extend my deepest gratitude to everybody on this call and everybody who continues to support Garratt Publishing and indeed Yarra Theological Union through the year. We very much appreciate all the support, and we can't do our mission without you. We want to foster a community of faith. We want to foster a better church, and you joining us, not just here in Australia, but in fact all over the globe, people join us from. And I'm very, very grateful for that. I'd also like to take just a moment to recognise my team at Garratt Publishing. We've had an amazingly difficult year with tragedy and joy, the ups and downs of life, but we're a very small team, and I wish to publicly acknowledge Sandy and Jolene and Rachel, who many of you will speak to on the phone or get emails from. They're the first line of people, to some extent, the face and voice of Garratt. And I also want to thank Charmaine, who sends you lots of emails, but also does the videos for you every week. And in fact, she's a marvel because she starts editing the videos within minutes of us finishing. And also Karen and Rose, who publish our books, who Mary and Chris would know well, but their dedication to producing upwards of 20 books a year is outstanding. And of course, Russell, who for 27 years has been sending out your books and resources. So, they've been an incredibly resilient team, and I just want to publicly thank them. Now, also, I must mention that in about 10 weeks or so, it's Lent,
Okay.
and we'll be back again after a bit of a refresh. I know, sorry, Mary, it's not that far away, and but we have got Andy Hamilton. Many people in Melbourne will know Andy, and in fact around Australia. But like Chris and Mary Rayburn and Mary Collo, he is a true treasure of the Australian Church. And so he's produced Many Paths Lead to Easter. So just as we journey through Advent and we come to journey through Lent in a couple of months' time, Andy's brilliant writing for the Many Paths of Easter. So that particular program is available today, and there will, of course, be a link to purchase in the video in the video email that comes out later later this week, of course. So just let me stop sharing. And finally, of course, to our wonderful presenters who year after year commit their time, their energy, their passion, and gift us these sessions. So thank you so much. Thank you. Doesn't seem really enough. Now, I think we've run a little bit of overtime, but I would like to say to everybody, I do hope that you have a blessed Christmas, a really happy and joyful time with your loved ones who are with us and those who aren't, because there are many tables that will have empty chairs. And so I'd like to recognise those people because they're in my life as well.
Yes, David.
So I hope you have a wonderful Christmas, a happy new year, and we look forward to your ongoing support and join us again in a few weeks.
Just 3 months' time, that's right.
Yeah, but there's a long way to go. And the other thing, of course, in this week, this time next week will be Christmas Eve, and there'll be kids running around in families and all excited about the coming of Santa and so forth. And I hope that everybody finds just a few minutes, like we have tonight, but just a few minutes in the next week, just to reflect on the true meaning of Christmas and the importance of the Lord in our life and in your lives. And of course, Mary's beautiful Zena.
Yes, who has enjoyed it all.
I'm sure.
She should get a certificate.
And no doubt she's learnt a lot.
Oh,
And she's got a good, solid theological
yeah,
base.
yeah, absolutely.
So she just won't think about those treats on Christmas
Oh,
morning.
no.
She
She
will
looks in
also
the
be
mirror
She'll
and
be
she sees
reflecting
God.
on. Yep, she'll be reflecting on the world around us. So, again, a very blessed Christmas to you all, and I will stop the recording now.
Thank
Okay,
you.
blessings,
And
everybody.
God bless.
many blessings.
Blessings, absolutely.